The 10 Worst Generals in History. Number 10. William Hull. William Hull was a hero of the American Revolution, but he performed so poorly in the War of 1812 that he was sentenced to death. In 1805, Hull was appointed governor of the territory of Michigan. When the War of 1812 broke out, Hull was commissioned Brigadier General and ordered to invade Upper Canada, modern-day Ontario. The British General Sir Isaac Brock sent a force to capture Fort Mackinac. In response, Hull panicked and ordered the evacuation of Fort Dearborn. The garrison was massacred by Native Americans as soon as they left the safety of their position. Meanwhile, Hull got himself pinned down in Detroit. He was convinced that General Brock and his ally, the Shawnee chief Tecumseh, had him badly outnumbered. In reality, the opposite was true, but Hull surrendered Detroit without a fight anyway. Afterward, Hull was court-martialed and convicted of cowardice and dereliction of duty. If President James Madison hadn't pardoned him, he would have become the only American general to face a firing squad. To be fair to Hull, he was an old man who pretty much begged not to be given command. He wasn't the worst general in American history. There are 2 other candidates we'll talk about later. But first, number 9, Imagawa Yashimoto. Yashimoto was a Japanese warlord who lived between 1519 and 1560. His career was largely successful, but the mistake that cost him his life was so stupid that it lands him on this list anyway. Yoshimoto spent years building alliances during the chaotic Sengoku period of Japanese history. At that time, the country was divided between many squabbling, ambitious lords. Yoshimoto's goal was to unite Japan under his rule as shogun. That dream was in sight, and Yashimoto was marching toward Kyoto at the head of an army 25,000 strong. No one could stop him, except himself. After winning a few initial victories, Yoshimoto and his men decided to cut loose, throw back a couple thousand gallons of sake, and celebrate their inevitable triumph. The next morning, an army of 3,000 men, who, by the way, were not hungover, surprised and spectacularly defeated Yoshimoto's army. Yoshimoto himself was cornered and killed by a pair of samurai. Number 8. Ferdinand Schorner. Schorner was a German commander in World War II. One of the ones no one talks about because he only became prominent toward the end of the war when Germany was in ruins. Schorner wasn't completely useless, but he was extremely cruel and kind of creepy with his men. From mid-1944 until the end of the war, Schorner was an army group commander on the Eastern Front, fighting to hold back the Soviet advance. But he's mostly remembered for waging war against his own troops. On the one hand, Schorner liked to go around giving candies to his men. On the other hand, he liked to hang them. A lot. See what we mean? Creepy. Schorner was ruthless, even by Nazi standards, particularly against deserters, or men he considered to be deserters, which was basically anyone who wasn't where he thought they should be for any reason. In 1945, Schorner issued an order that any man found behind the lines without written orders to be there should be summarily court-martialed and hanged with a placard around his neck saying, "I am a deserter. I have declined to defend German women and children." Maybe some of the many, many men executed were deserters. Some were probably just lost. You know, like the war they were fighting. The kicker is that Schorner himself was a deserter. Trapped in Prague at the end of the war, terrified of being captured by the Soviets, he abandoned his men to their fate and fled west to surrender to the Americans, who handed him over to the Soviets anyway. Number 7. Sir William Howe. Sir William Howe was arguably the biggest reason America won the War of Independence. Howe was the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America from 1775 to 1778. His officers bemoaned the fact that he was outwardly competent to the point of arrogance, but inwardly consumed by doubt. In 1777, Howe conceived a plan to march north from New York and meet up with a smaller force marching south from Canada under General John Burgoyne. The objective was to capture Albany and effectively cut off New England from the rest of the country. But Howe was also obsessed with the idea of taking Philadelphia, so instead of marching north to help Burgoyne, he sailed south for the city of brotherly love. Strong coastal defenses meant Howe had to spend an extra month at sea. When he did land, the going was tough. He managed to capture the city, but George Washington almost pushed him back. Meanwhile, General Burgoyne, who had no idea Howe was in Philly getting cheesesteak, marched into upstate New York with 7,000 men. When the reinforcements he was promised never materialized, he found himself surrounded and outnumbered, and was forced to surrender his whole army. Within a matter of months, the British had abandoned Philadelphia. Howe's conquest of the city accomplished nothing, and cost the British their best chance of victory. Number 6. Lloyd Fredendall. Fredendall was chosen to lead the American Corps when the Allies landed in North Africa in 1942. Basically, he got the job because superiors liked him. He was brash, arrogant, opinionated, and didn't listen to anyone else, which the brass somehow thought would be a recipe for success. Upon landing in Tunisia, Fredendall moved into a grand hotel and began issuing reports labeled "From the Field." This earned him the enmity of his men, most of whom were sleeping rough in the actual field. Or, in the desert. Fredendall's obsession with his own accommodations continued as his army moved out to confront the Germans under General Erwin Rommel. He spent weeks overseeing the construction of a new headquarters, a bunker complex blasted out of solid rock and guarded by an entire battalion of anti-aircraft guns. It was a full 70 miles from the front. Fredendall was also desperate to obtain a bulletproof Cadillac and made frequent calls demanding it be delivered to him faster. Meanwhile, he set about breaking his corps apart and spreading his troops too thinly. Fredendall rarely left his headquarters, but refused to take advice from officers who had actually been to the front. The result of all this was the most embarrassing American defeat of World War II, the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Fredendall's badly led corps lost 183 tanks, 208 big guns, and 6,300 men killed, wounded, or missing. His replacement, General George Patton, remarked that he didn't know how Fredendall could justify his existence. Damn. Number 5. Sir Charles Townshend. It's almost like being an aristocrat or having a knighthood doesn't automatically make you a genius. During World War I, Sir Charles Townshend was stationed in India and Persia. Basically, his job was to keep the region under British control and prevent the Ottomans from attacking. He was in a perfectly secure position and didn't have to move or do anything, really, and that was the problem. Townshend and his boss, John Nixon, wanted action. They decided to march their men into Iraq and take the city of Baghdad, basically so they could say they did. Townshend's army had a number of shortcomings. They had no heavy guns, they were short on drinking water, food, tents, helmets, grenades, even blankets. Worst of all, they had very few medical supplies or doctors. Despite all this, Townshend didn't ask for any help and went ahead enthusiastically. At first, his campaign was stunningly successful. His men fought their way up the Tigris River, seizing towns and beating larger Ottoman armies. But the near absence of medical treatment meant that any man who was injured was likely to die. A hospital ship returned from the front with its deck covered in wounded and dying troops. It was so overcrowded that the men had to defecate onto the deck and sleep amid, quote, stalactites of human feces, end quote. Disease, desertion, and stiffening Ottoman resistance quickly turned Townshend's triumph to tragedy. He was forced to hole himself up in the town of Kut, where he and his men endured a 147-day siege. About 30,000 of Townshend's men were killed in the hopeless defense. Many more died in Ottoman captivity after he surrendered. Not Townshend, however. The Ottomans treated him as an honored guest, and he enjoyed the VIP treatment for the rest of the war. He was having so much fun as a POW that his wife actually wrote him a letter begging him to tone it down. A complete dick. Number 4. Gideon J. Pillow. Gideon J. Pillow was a Confederate general in the American Civil War, most famously associated with the surrender of Fort Donelson in 1862, a major victory for the Union. Pillow was nominally second in command at Fort Donelson, but his superior, John Floyd, knew nothing about warfare and basically let Pillow do as he pleased. When Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant surrounded Fort Donelson, Pillow devised a plan to punch a hole through enemy lines and fight free of the encirclement. The first part of the plan actually worked. Pillow succeeded in breaking the Union lines, but then inexplicably pulled back to let his men rest before breaking out. While the aptly named Pillow's men were taking a nap, the Union soldiers regained all the ground they'd lost, basically sealing the fate of Pillow's army. But not Pillow himself. When it was clear Fort Donelson was doomed, Floyd panicked. He believed that if the Union captured him, he would be tried for treason and hanged. He turned over command to Pillow and fled. Pillow then promptly turned over command to his subordinate, Simon Bolivar Buckner, followed Floyd's example, and ran away. On top of all his other failings, Pillow was incredibly vain. Pillow was genuinely convinced his capture would be the end of the Confederacy. As Buckner told Grant after the surrender of Fort Donelson, he thought you'd rather get hold of him than any other man in the Southern Confederacy. To which Grant replied, "If I had got him, I'd let him go again. He will do us more good commanding you fellows." Number 3. Quintus Servilius Caepio. We're going all the way back to ancient Rome for this one, specifically to 105 BC. In that year, a tribe called the Cimbri were migrating through northern Italy. 2 men were sent with 2 different armies to deal with the invaders, Malleus Maximus and our boy Caepio. Combined, they had at least 80,000 men under their command. Caepio was an extremely proud man from an ancient aristocratic family. He disliked Maximus, who outranked him, despite being a self-made man with no distinguished ancestors. Caepio refused to take orders from Maximus, to camp with him, or even to confer with him. It seems that Caepio wanted all the glory of defeating the Cimbri for himself, so he launched a reckless, ill-prepared attack without even informing Maximus. His army was completely shredded. Having routed half the Roman force, the Cimbri pressed on and smashed the other half as well. The exact death toll will never be known for sure, but Roman sources suggest a near total loss, something on the order of 80,000 soldiers killed, plus perhaps 40,000 more servants and camp followers. That makes the Battle of Orazio easily the worst defeat in Roman history. Number 2. Clement Voroshilov. Voroshilov was a loyal communist who won fame defending the city that would later become Stalingrad during the Russian Civil War. Because of this, he was appointed Soviet Minister of Defense from 1925 until 1940. During that time, he played a key role in Stalin's infamous purges of the Red Army. Thousands of officers were dismissed, imprisoned, or killed under Voroshilov in the late 1930s. In 1939, the Soviet Union invaded its tiny neighbor, Finland. Voroshilov assumed command, leading an army of 760,000 against a Finnish force less than half that size, many of whom had to supply their own rifles. Voroshilov had 6,500 tanks against 32 on the Finnish side. To counter the 114 planes of Finland's air force, he had 3,800. In 3 months of fighting, Voroshilov's army suffered between 320 and 380,000 casualties, a rate of about 50%. He also lost between 1,200 and 3,500 tanks to go along with about 500 planes. And for that high price, the war still wasn't won. Stalin was able to pressure the Finns into a humiliating and temporary peace treaty, but the Winter War was a disgrace for the Soviet Union. Voroshilov was largely sidelined for the rest of World War II, though, ironically, Stalin never purged the one general he probably should have shot. Number 1. Luigi Cadorna. Luigi Cadorna was the commander-in-chief of the Italian army for most of World War I, and oh boy was he a train wreck. Italy joined World War I in 1915, fighting alongside France, Great Britain, and eventually the United States. But relative to all these countries, Italy's army was extremely weak. It was short of men and had almost no artillery. And artillery was the decisive weapon of World War I. Instead of conserving his small, ill-equipped force, Cadorna decided to send it charging across the Isonzo River and up the Alps into entrenched enemy positions. 11 times. These 11 battles of the Isonzo mostly resulted in minor tactical victories for the Italians, but the gains were pretty much worthless and came at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. In all, 531,000 Italian soldiers would die during the war. Cadorna's failures can't be blamed on a senior officer either, because there wasn't one. He demanded and received complete discretion to do whatever he wanted, and he did. Apart from his incompetence, Cadorna was also stupidly strict with his troops. About 6% of the men under his command faced a disciplinary charge at one point or another. Cadorna had 750 men under his command executed. No other World War I commander has a record like this. There were also reports that Cadorna revived the ancient Roman practice of decimation, the execution of 1 man in 10, as a way of punishing underperforming units. So there you have it, the 10 worst generals in history, at least according to us. What do you think? Did we miss someone especially bad? Do you think one of the guys we listed is actually awesome? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to History Snob for more content.